Welcome to Flat, Cool, and Acid-Free, an OK State Archives podcast, bringing you stories about Oklahoma State University and Oklahoma. On this episode,
it used to get blown up, just like a lot of these pieces do, where it's just like, oh, well, bigger and bigger, and what else happened to the bull, and what did the bull do? But really, I think, it's interesting to get down to the heart of when you can find what actually happened.
Samantha Mackey, Archives Digital Storytelling Intern, Sarah Milligan, Head of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, and David Peters, Head of the University Archives, discussed the legends and mysteries of OSU.
About urban legends and mysteries of OSU. So how do things kind of become urban legends?
I'm so excited to talk about this. So I want to say first that I may be department head for the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, but I'm also a folklorist. And one of the things that folklorists study is urban legends and the way that we understand culture and myth. So this is so fun for me. Along those lines, whenever the people who do study things like urban legends, and we record the way that different people come about these things and document like all the different variations and all that kinds of things, one of the things that we think about whenever you're trying to figure out, like, is something that somebody's telling you, like maybe an urban legend, or maybe it's something that really happened, and you're working this through your mind, there's a couple of actual sort of tests you can run it through. So you can think about, is this something that is just really too convenient, right? Like, are all the things really just kind of like laid out there to where they fall into place really perfectly? So maybe it's just a little bit too well fitted. Is it something that is maybe an indeterminate time? So like a few years ago, or way back in the day, or, in the 60s, or just something that's really vague as to it's not going to commit to a time, or necessarily it might be tied to a place, but it maybe had vague pieces. Are there changing pieces that happen whenever people tell it? Like, oh no, that was so-and-so, but it was so-and-so. It was like the student at the end of the semester that was stressed out by grades and stressed out by finals, but it was then it was a student who was breaking up with her boyfriend who was stressed out by, so like are those pieces sort of sometimes moving? And the other thing is, like, when you think about sources, like, where did this person that you're talking about this to, where did they hear it? And often one of the key triggers for this is, I heard this from a friend of a friend, right? Like, that is like the F for F, friend of a friend for a friend, friend of a friend. So think about all those big things, like, what is it someone trying to tell you? Is it something that is like way too comfortable and way too polished, and at the same time a little vague, either when it happened or to whom it happened or who you first heard this for? So it's kind of the same thing that you run through any information sort of truth telling. And I think I feel like we're getting better at sort of sourcing these in the last few years anyway, but it's just, you run it through those tests of could this be true? And if I wanted to find out if it is true, do I have enough information in this that I could actually start to research that? Like, do I know enough about who it might involve that I could go to a newspaper article or something like that? So basically, you also gut check it a little bit. If someone's telling you something and you're like, oh, that's really interesting, I would love to believe this. And you're like, I'm trying really hard to believe this. It's probably not true in the sense, it doesn't mean it's not based in some root of fact. And one of the biggest ways that urban legends can catch on and be successful is if they could be true, right? Like, you could see how it could possibly totally happen, even if it's really inconceivable that it actually did, right? And so sometimes things are rooted in those like nuggets of truth, or maybe not even nugget of happenstance, and just sort of build out over time.
But I think sometimes too, it's also easier to cloud the issue now with technology. So we can track down perhaps the source, but then you can create alternative,
or a false source,
right? And sometimes that can kind of cloud whether something is true or not.
Or you point to something that seems it's likely, but it's not real, right?
Right.
Like, oh, this could totally be it. I can see this is the smoking gun. This is the of this, or whatever it is. And it's just like, if you really try and dig down deeper, it's not. It just seems convenient that it could be.
Right now, one of the more popular urban legends on campus is that there are a bunch of tunnels that run under campus. So is that real? Is that true? Or is it just blown way out of proportion.
That is not a legend. There are tunnels that run across campus. They were designed initially about 1910 to move utilities, so power, water, sometimes gas, underground when we built our first power plant in 1910. So they began building these tunnels. They connected the early part of campus, which is around Old Central. But of course, as campus has expanded, the tunnels have expanded. And as the power plants have changed in locations, those tunnel locations have also changed. But there are tunnels. They're not accessible. They're restricted access. But yes, there's a whole network of tunnels under this campus. And if you had to, you could get from one place to another through the tunnel system. So it's not a legend. It's true.
But the question is, what do people say happens in those tunnels? That could be the legend part. If there's people saying, oh, well, somebody could come from one to the other and, 10 years ago or some time ago.
So a myth or a legend I've heard is that a student actually lived in the tunnels back in the 50s for a semester. I don't know if it's true or not.
Listen to all the keys there, though, right?
Right.
So that's great. Yeah. So the tunnels are like sort of the factual truth piece of that you can totally conceive something would happen in, but.
Yeah. And I didn't hear it from a friend of a friend.
The tunnel. But maybe the 50s someone lived down there, maybe, right?
Yeah.
Right. So another story that's more of a superstition is that if a student walks up the front steps of Morrill Hall, she won't graduate in 4 years. So does that kind of follow the same path as an urban legend? And kind of like, where does that sort of thing come from?
Is it just for women? She
no,
won't, or for men or women?
Men or women,
women.
It's any student.
So from what I'm aware, that's a fairly recent one. When I was in school here in the 70s, I don't remember that at all. Or maybe it's just maybe it's regional. Maybe it has to do with Morrill Hall and the English department being in Morrill Hall, and some creative English student was 4 years out and hadn't graduated yet and had to come up with an excuse to their parents. I don't know, but I think that's a fairly recent one. But I'm not sure how it transitions into becoming a superstition. Or
I think it's just the more people to repeat it, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of the times when you're talking about whether it's superstitions or whether it's urban legends or anything, they're often trying to comment on something, right? Like, so you think about what that is trying to say, and it's really looking at the stress students have and how often, because of that stress, it's easier to sometimes look for places to be like, well, if I wouldn't have walked up the stairs, and though I don't really think anyone's ever going to say I failed out of school because I walked up the stairs, but there's always that thing we're looking for that kind of says, well, maybe this was outside of something I could control, right? And so I think that's how some of those things get born and also perpetuate. Who knows how that, we will probably never know the first instance that someone said, well, this is, it was all because I walked up those stairs. But I think the fact that it keeps being told over and over and over is what is really, sort of interesting to look at with that too.
And those stairs are a little unusual in that that's the only staircase on campus that goes to the second floor. Mm-hmm. Every place else, stairs lead to the first floor if there are stairs. That's the only one that goes to the second floor, so it's a little unique in that way. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's a distinctive thing or not, but that's the only place on campus that has that feature.
Someone could do a research paper on that and see if they can actually figure it out or pin it down or all that kind of stuff.
We have a question from William, and he wants to know, what is your favorite campus tall tale?
You know way more of them than I do.
Tall tale. Well, one thing I think is interesting is probably our most popular picture, and it's featured periodically in our Facebook page, is the Streaker Night and the bull going into Theta Pond. Mm-hmm. There have been literally hundreds of people who all claim they were the one who rode the bull into the pond. Now, I think there were 2 or 3 people who rode the bull in the pond, but there weren't hundreds of people. And so we do have a picture of the bull in the pond with several people on it and a lot of people around it. But the claim that they were on the bull has been exaggerated by many folks. I found those kinds of events or those stories interesting because there was an event, just people have put themselves into it at a position or level maybe they hadn't really participated in.
And it gets a little bit bigger with each telling.
Each yell.
Yeah. When we do oral history interviews and we talk to people about their time on campus, some of those things do come out too. And, for example, there's a lot of people that talk about like the alligator in Theta Pond, and or several different versions of and things like that. And some of those sound like they could be more contemporary legend than maybe fact, but there is some fact based in those too.
There was Sam the alligator in Theta Pond for a short time. So there was a reality. There was an incident where some students took a bull, I think, or a steer into an elevator at the student union. But I've heard that same story told for other facilities. But we think it only happened at the union.
That's the only, and we have. That's actually really those are interesting pieces to bring together, because I think the student union actually did happen because there was some student conduct things that came out of that. Right. There's some evidence there, and we have interviews with some people who say that they were involved in that, and kind of talking about it a little jokingly. And then we have at least one interview where someone talks about it, and it's not really funny anymore. So it's one of those things that even though people usually after they tell that over and over, it's continues to get blown up, just like a lot of these pieces do, where it's just like, oh well, bigger and bigger, and what else happened to the bull, and what did the bull do? But really, I think it's interesting to get down to the heart of when you can find what actually happened, which sometimes in oral history we do try and find people who were actually there. I mean, that's what we try and do. We find people who experience things firsthand, and we talk to them about those. And so we did an Amplified Oklahoma, our podcast in oral history. We did an episode where we looked at different ways of memory in the way that we understand events, and used Sam the alligator and the bull to illustrate those different things. So that has always been interesting to me too.
Great. We have a comment from Bonnie, and she said that when she was an undergrad in the late 90s, the Moral Hall legend was being spread. She's surprised that one is still going strong. Well, and I remember when I was a freshman, I entered as an English major, and they gave us a tour of Moral Hall, and they told us not to walk up the front steps. So it's still something that's being talked about really, really recently.
So who told you that?
I don't remember if it was an orientation leader or just a regular campus tour guide, but it was definitely somebody that had a little bit of influence over the incoming freshman students.
Well, it's interesting what the campus tour guides pick up, because I mean, obviously, you have to walk through all this, and you're trying to not bore people to death too. And so I think that is a lot of places that, especially campus lore, gets picked up and perpetuated, is through some campus tours and through guides and different people, and then they talk to each other and talk about how that was responded to and what reaction you get. And there's a lot of really, really common campus legends that are out there that it would be interesting to know if people have heard them in relation to OSU too. I mean, some of the really, really common ones are, for example, a lot of campus libraries across the country have a legend attached to it that the building is sinking, and the building's sinking because the architecture developed the building but didn't factor in the weight of the books. And so when they put the books in, that the building started to sink, or the building can never be at full capacity with books, because then it will start to, there's like all these pieces to it. And that's one that I think whenever people hear it, they think, oh, that's definitely our library. But when you take the survey, it's, there's just widely spread across different campuses. And there's just a lot of really interesting, almost everyone has like a ghost in the dorm, it seems like, and it's usually some very tragic young lady who was either jilted by a boyfriend, or couldn't hack the finals, or was being tormented by somebody who was making noises next door, or whatever it is, or ghosts in the library. There's a lot of those. So it would be interesting. It's interesting to see what crosses, not only just what sticks at OSU over time, but what crosses over various college campuses, and how those things get perpetuated and moved to is really interesting.
So,
I'm just going to add, I've passed by numerous campus tours over time.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And at times I've wanted to jump in, but I keep thinking, why ruin a good story with the truth? So I just let them go, and because it really, the story is in fact, I will stop and listen sometimes to the story just to hear what people are saying. So anyway.
So are these kinds of legends popular on all college campuses?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So is the library haunted?
Well, I think it depends on how you feel about that. I think if this is right, this is the question. Are you asking if people think that there might be a ghost in the library? Of course, there are plenty of people who have stories about that. David, I don't know. What do you think?
And I'm a skeptic, so I'm not a true believer. But I've heard stories. I've heard a number of people talk about, especially in the basement, a woman dressed in a certain attire. I think it's a red dress, but it's a certain. They describe a certain color dress, and she's there, and then all of a sudden she's not there. And so I've heard this. I've been here almost 35 years, and so I've heard people talk about that. I've never witnessed it, so.
Yeah, I have heard the basement story too.
Okay. There's also been instances where people claim that books have just fallen off the shelf. All of a sudden, the book just was on the floor. I don't know whether someone was on the other side, putting a book back in, and the book caught and knocked it over. Who knows? But you can look at two people can look at the same event and get a different impression of what happened. So.
Right. Okay. So one last question before we go. If I wanted to research some of these legends on my own and kind of try and figure out if I can maybe see where they started, or maybe try and figure out if they're based more in truth or fiction, where in the archival collections could I look?
So do you have some oral histories that include some material like that?
We do have oral histories. Specifically, we have lots of oral histories specifically about OSU. Several hundred interviews with the alumni and former and current faculty and staff. And people do, every once in a while, they talk about sort of like, some of those things. They're not going to be in great detail, though. I think actually, if someone's interested in this topic just in general, to get a better understanding of maybe how to identify or how to think about these things, there's some really good books in the library as well, though. Like Jan Brunvard is someone who's written extensively about oral history, about urban legends, and has, for example, the Urban Legend Encyclopedia of Urban Legends, and several books that go through this. Simon Bronner is a really good person to look at, Linda Daig. There are just some really, I think Simon Bronner actually wrote like a campus urban legend book about, like urban legends that just kind of perpetuate across college campuses that you can check out. I think you can even check that out here as an ebook. But I know if you're thinking about specifically trying to dig down on when the first instance of something maybe was reported or talked about for a specific tale or version of a tale.
So then we have specific resources for OSU. The older yearbooks will sometimes mention, you can't tell if it's in play or not. We have old publications like the Aggivator that would include stuff like this. Then of course the Daily Oak Collegian and its predecessor titles. Those are all available for people to search online, and there'll be stories in there. They can search to see how often it's been mentioned and what time periods. Maybe different things have come up in the student newspapers. Plus we have the Centennial History series, and there are a few mentions within the series of events or purported events. So between the periodicals, the yearbooks, and the O'Colly, and then the Centennial History series, they can probably discover some other things in the archives.
This episode was part of the Archives Live, a monthly video broadcast. Watch the broadcast and stay in touch with the archives by liking and following the Oklahoma State University Archives Facebook page. Find a link to that page in the show notes. This episode featured Samantha Mackey, Sarah Milligan, and David Peters. Produced by Nina Thornton. The music is It's a Process, composed by Ben Stone and Finley Green, and published by BBC Production Music, PRS. From the folks at the Oklahoma State University Libraries, the Archives, and the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, thanks for listening. And always remember to keep your archival material flat, cool, and acid-free.